All right, we go back to Iran now, and we've asked Professor Mohammad Marandi from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran in Iran to give us an update on the biggest challenge Iran is now facing with regards to coronavirus. Professor Marandi, I hope you can hear me now, and do apologize for that break in transmission. You were just taking us through whether you get a sense if Iran is getting to grips with the containment measures around COVID-19. Do you want to pick up on that point?
Yes, Iran has been making significant progress, and the casualty rate has, over the last 3 days, has remained almost static. In other words, the number of deaths as a result of the virus have remained static, but because of the new year and because many people will travel during the Iranian New Year, which is the first day of spring, this is going to be a problem. Most people are staying at home, but unfortunately, some people are not. The government has so far refused to take draconian measures, but if the numbers of people who are going on vacation outside of cities increases, I think that the government is going to increase limitations, or they're going to start limiting the number of people who could travel outside of major cities.
An interesting fact, Professor, is that ministers are quite reluctant to impose the compulsory quarantines because the government ostensibly does not have the necessary resources, to cover the welfare payments to some of the low-income workers. And you'll agree with me that quarantine is a very important component in containment.
Well, part of the problem is that because of the U.S. sanctions, the economic situation in Iran has become more difficult, and imposing a full quarantine makes it very difficult for people who have day jobs and who are paid on a daily basis to sustain themselves. So the United States is not only intentionally preventing Iran from importing medicine and equipment for hospitals and for detecting the virus and to deal with patients, but it is also through the sanctions made the economic situation more difficult, and thus that gives the government less capacity to give aid to the more vulnerable. So the government is trying to make a balancing act where on the one hand they don't take draconian measures, but on the other hand, through promoting the idea that the virus is very dangerous, and by encouraging people to stay home, and through certain measures that are not draconian but create limitations, they are trying to on the one hand create an incentive for people to stay at home, and on the other to create some restrictions to also increase that incentive for people not to leave the house.
You just mentioned sanctions, but then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced that the United States has agreed to ease sanctions covering banking to allow medicines to reach Iran.
With all due respect to your viewers, he is lying. He is just, it's a lie. The United States government is utterly dishonest. The U.S. government is trying desperately to prevent Iran from importing any sort of medicine, let alone the kits to detect the coronavirus. It is truly extraordinary what the Americans are trying to do. It is an attempt to create mass suffering and mass casualties. It is genocidal. And because it is so openly disgusting and so shameless, he has to go in public and pretend that it is otherwise. But at the moment, Iranian pharmaceutical companies are not able to get any form of cooperation with Western pharmaceutical companies because they are being directly threatened by the U.S. government.
Well, what do you make then of threats, if I'd call it that the United States to Iran, saying that coronavirus won't save Iran from further sanctions?
Well, that's exactly the point. What he wants to do and what Trump wants to do is to create a situation where Iran cannot protect itself from the coronavirus. The U.S. government wants the virus to spread in Iran. It wants to bring about mass casualties in order to undermine the government, in order to undermine the state. I mean, this is not unprecedented, by the way. I myself survived 2 chemical attacks during the war when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. Those chemical weapons were provided to Saddam Hussein by the United States and its Western European allies. So it's not as if the United States is a country that would refrain from carrying out such genocidal policies. What the United States government right now is doing is that it's preventing banks from cooperating with Iran. Not a single bank in the world, in Europe, in Western countries, can transfer a single euro or dollar to or from Iran. It is impossible. For medicine or for food or for anything else, it is absolutely impossible. And on the other hand, pharmaceutical companies are too afraid and intimidated to cooperate with Iran. And they say so very explicitly in their written exchanges with Iranian companies, that we simply cannot work with you. Even just recently, a Korean company has stopped cooperating with Iran under pressure from the United States. So Pompeo is lying, and the objective is quite clear. It is a genocidal policy, and I think it's very important for independent countries to increase their resistance to the United States, because this is a rogue regime that is really out of control.
Just on Monday, China, we do understand, called on the United States to give, to give Iran sanctions relief for humanitarian reasons. Any signs of this kind of communication, and is there any evidence of the United States responding to this?
No, the Iranians don't believe that the United States will change their policy. It is, as I said, the objective of the United States is to create mass suffering, and they intimidate independent countries to make them refrain from cooperating with Iran. Of course, China has sent aid to Iran, and when the virus outbreak began in China, Iran sent aid to China, even though it's under sanctions. But except for China and 2 or 3 other countries, we have yet to receive aid from anyone else. The Europeans have not sent anything except for a very small amount from France, very insignificant. A few neighboring countries have helped. But ultimately, the Iranians are on their own, and they are carrying out, the efforts of the doctors and nurses and the medical teams across the country are truly heroic under these circumstances. The armed forces are helping. They've given their hospitals, all of the military hospitals and soldiers across the country are aiding physicians and nurses, and they are having some success with the containment, even though, as I said, a significant number of people have traveled, unfortunately, during this new year. But we'll have to see. It's a tough time. But now, as the virus grows in Europe and the United States, their whole argument and their whole propaganda of Iran mismanaging the virus has been undermined, because we see the situation in Europe and the United States getting out of control. And the irony is that Iran, under sanctions, is doing a better job, it appears from where I'm sitting, than the Americans or the Europeans.
Well, Iran has reportedly released a U.S. citizen by the name of Michael White from its custody, even though they say that he must stay in Iran. What should we read into this? Is this perhaps a gesture to Washington? And if so, what kind of gesture is it?
Well, there are 2 things here. One is that Iran has released a large number of people in prison in order to contain the virus, because prisons obviously are not a good place to be when there is an outbreak. So all of those prisoners who could be released have been released. I think roughly, if I'm not mistaken, almost one third of all prisoners are out of prison at the moment. Of course, these people have not committed major crimes like murder or rape or anything like that. But and they ultimately will probably return to prison once this critical period ends. This person has been released under those circumstances, but there is talk of an exchange. So just as we've been speaking, an Iranian in France who is to be extradited to the United States on trumped-up charges, he is being returned to Iran. So could this be part of an exchange? I don't know. We'll have to see. But it does look like that may be the case.
Professor Mohammed Marandi from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran, Iran. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.